I want to speak today about the uniqueness of Israel, the Jewish people, having an irrevocable gift and call from God, that they have a distinct purpose in this world. In Romans chapter 11, after Shaul speaks about the fact that the Jewish people not coming to faith in Yeshua is a temporary situation, and that situation will come to an end, and that our people will turn to Yeshua, and it will lead to life from the dead, as he says in Romans 11:15. What will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And he says, if part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy, meaning that the Jewish people are still holy, they're still God's people, and the fact of the Jewish people that believe in Yeshua, the saved remnant of Israel, prove the continued holiness of the whole nation. But then after talking about Israel turning to the Lord at the end of days, and that all Israel will be saved, he then says this in an amazing text, verses 11, 28, and 29. As far as the gospel is concerned, they're enemies on your account, but as far as the election is concerned, they're loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. In other words, the Jewish people have an irrevocable calling of God. We're an elect people as a people. This does not in any way do away with the importance of the fact that God has now elected a people from all nations in partnership with the Jewish people who share priesthood with the Jewish people. Nevertheless, the Jewish people are still an elect, distinct, ethnic people. At the same time, both are true, the election of the people from the nations and the election of the Jewish people as a distinct ethnic people. But what does Shaul mean when he says of the Jewish people that they have a distinct, irrevocable level of gifts and an irrevocable calling? God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. So we need to now talk about what are the irrevocable gifts and what are the irrevocable calling. The irrevocable gifts of the Jewish people are connected to the calling, because the gifts of the Jewish people are, number one, to inherit the land that we're living in, the land of Israel. That's one of the gifts. Then one of the other gifts is that we're given a pattern of life that preserves us as a people and as a testimony to the nation. One of the other gifts of God to us is that we are going to be an instrument of the salvation of the world, and have already been an instrument of the salvation of the world, because as Yeshua said, salvation is of the Jews, and the salvation came from the Jewish people who followed Yeshua to the nations of the world. Without the Jewish people, there is no offer of salvation to the nations. Now, we have to think more deeply about the meaning of the calling of the Jewish people. And the primary calling of the Jewish people is to be a distinct priesthood as an ethnic people. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, God says to the Jewish people, "You are a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." He said before that to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Bereshit 12:3. In your seed, that is, I'll say it again, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So the nature of priesthood is to bring God's blessing to the nations. Actually, it is to play a mediatorial role. It is to bring the nations to God and to bring God to the nations. And this is the role that we have done and will continue to do. But our very existence as a nation is a proof of the reality of God. Did you ever think of the fact that if a Jewish person says he's an atheist, that it's a contradiction in terms both by putting atheist and Jewish in the same statement? As a matter of fact, when a Jewish person says he is an atheist, the person who is not Jewish immediately thinks of the Ten Commandments and Moses and Mount Sinai. So even a Jewish person who claims to be an atheist cannot but witness to the reality of God and his covenant, and the reality of God having a law standard that is required of all the nations of the world. The Jewish people, therefore, are a witness people. Our very existence is a proof of the existence of God, and a proof of the standards of God, and a proof that ultimately the nations will be judged by the standards of God. In addition to that, the Jewish pattern of life proves God's covenant faithfulness, because all of the celebrations and feasts of Israel are about God's faithfulness, who rescued us from slavery in Egypt and brought us into the promised land, and will yet redeem us as a people and bring us into the age to come. So therefore, all of the feasts celebrate God's provision and God's ultimate purpose for the last days. When we celebrate Passover, for example, we celebrate the first fruits of the crops that come. We celebrate being delivered from Egypt. We celebrate that we were delivered from the angel of death. But we also look forward to the ultimate deliverance and the ultimate entrance into the promised land, when the Messiah comes and delivers us from the oppression of the nations, and all people can enter into the promised land of God together. That is, the world becomes promised land, even though we as a Jewish people will inherit this promised land, the land of Israel. All of the feasts celebrate this kind of three-part dimension: the historical part, fulfillment in Yeshua, and then fulfillment in the second coming when Yeshua comes. So, for example, when we think of Passover again, we think of the Exodus from Egypt, but we also think that he is the Passover lamb who takes away the sin of the world, and we enter into a new Exodus in him, in a personal experience of death and resurrection, where we are filled with his Spirit. When we celebrate the Feast of Shavuot, we remember the first major harvest of the year in the month of May, June, in that particular time of year. But then we also remember that God gave his law during this season, and we remember that he poured out his Spirit on the Feast of Pentecost, or Shavuot, and that one day the whole earth will be full of the knowledge of God. The whole earth